I used to fix machines. That was my title, my identity, my pass through every checkpoint and guarded gate in the Citadel. Alan Tanner, Senior Technician, Cybernetics Division, Tier 1 clearance. I kept the scanners calibrated. I maintained the filtration arrays that told the committee who was clean and who was contaminated. When the sensors said a man was unfit, I had written the software that said it. I had not thought of myself as someone who decided who lived. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. The Citadel sat on a plateau above the old industrial valley, and from certain windows you could see where the cities used to be, long gray smears on the horizon, like old bruises that had never healed. I had lived my adult life in those windows and thought the view was simply landscape. I had not thought about what the gray smears had been made of. It is remarkable what a man can fail to think about when his meals come on time and his work is interesting and the people around him are all similarly incurious. The Citadel was comfortable in the particular that institutions are comfortable when they have decided collectively not to think too hard about the source of their comfort. War had happened before I was born. That is the first thing to understand. I did not choose this world. I inherited it. The nuclear exchange had left roughly a third of the surviving population clean, verified radiation-free through bone marrow assay and genetics screening, and the other 2/3 contaminated to varying degrees. Contamination did not always mean sickness, not immediately. It meant the markers were in the blood. It meant the committee classified you as deficient. It meant relocation to the preserves. I had processed those classifications. The scanners I maintained produced the numbers. Other divisions handled relocation. I had not asked what relocation entailed, and nobody had offered to tell me. In 11 years, it had never occurred to me to ask. I had designed a precise and elegant intake system, 4 redundant sensor arrays, a weighted statistical model for borderline readings, a clean interface that displayed results in green for clean, and amber for review and red for contaminated. And I had never once followed the red classifications to their destination. I had built the first door and called it the whole hallway. My wife's name was Clara. She had fair hair and a habit of humming when she read. Low and unconscious, which used to irritate me mildly, and which I would give anything now to hear one more time. She had been born in the southern sector, and the southern sector had taken a secondary plume during the war. A slow drift of particles that had not been considered significant for 30 years, until the committee updated its threshold models. The update reclassified 7,000 people overnight. The committee had sent the revised parameters to my terminal for system integration 2 weeks before the reclassification ran. I had implemented them without reading the downstream effects. I was good at implementation. I was good at solving a problem directly in front of me, without examining what the problem was in service of. Clara was one of the 7,000 I found out on a Tuesday. The scan notification came to my terminal because I was listed as her emergency contact, and I was the man who ran the terminals. So the system had no hesitation routing the verdict directly to my desk. Contaminated, Tier 3 marker concentration, relocation scheduled, 14 days. The notification was formatted in the same clean interface I had designed. The text was red. I had chosen red because it was highly visible and unambiguous. I sat at my desk for a while and looked at it. Then I went to the committee. I had credentials. I had access. It built arguments about margin of error and scanner drift, and the statistical noise inherent in Tier 3 classifications, all of which were true, and none of which mattered. The Tier 3 threshold had, in fact, a documented variance of plus or minus 11%. I knew because I had written the documentation, which meant a substantial fraction of Tier 3 classifications were within the noise envelope of a clean reading. I had flagged this in my original system report 4 years ago. The committee had acknowledged the flag and maintained the threshold. They had reasons for this that I had not examined. The man I spoke to listened with the polite attention of someone waiting for a machine to finish processing. He had small, careful hands and the specific stillness of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts. When I was done, he told me that the committee's decisions were final, that appeals required a 2/3 vote of the senior board, and that my wife's relocation was scheduled in compliance with the protocols I myself had helped design. He said this last part without emphasis, which was more effective than emphasis would have been. He was correct that I had helped design the protocols. That was the part I could not argue past. I went home and told Clara. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened to difficult things. Very still, with her hands in her lap, processing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You knew what the preserve was for, didn't you? Some part of you." It was not quite an accusation. It was more like a diagnosis. I told her I had not known. I told her I had not asked. She said those were two different things, and she was right. And I did not have a response to that. We did not talk about it again, because there was no time and no point. But I have carried that distinction for the years since. Not knowing and not asking, two different things. I spent 3 days after the committee meeting trying to identify another path. I am a systematic thinker. I do not move quickly to the conclusion that there is no solution, because systems are complex and most apparent dead ends have a bypass route that requires patience to locate. I examined the appeals process and calculated the realistic probability of assembling a 2/3 vote of the senior board, which was a committee composed of men with the same interests as the man I had already spoken to. Not zero, but close enough to zero to be the same for practical purposes. I examined the possibility of external legal intervention, which would have required a functioning legal authority operating outside the Citadel's jurisdiction. And such an authority did not exist in any meaningful form in the world the war had produced. I examined the possibility of simply taking Clara and leaving the Citadel voluntarily, going into the wasteland before the relocation date. But the wasteland without preparation was a different kind of death sentence. And I had no preparation, and 14 days was not enough time to build any. I gave serious weight to the possibility that I was wrong about what the preserve was. I was aware that my reasoning was not neutral. I had a personal stake in the conclusion, exactly the condition under which a man's judgment is most likely to serve his wishes rather than the evidence. I went back through the administrative document and read it again slowly, looking for the interpretation that made it something other than what it appeared to be. The language resisted alternate readings. Resource application documentation is either accurate or it is fraud, and the committee had operated without external scrutiny for long enough that its documentation was simply direct. The broadcasting was what was left when every other path had been examined and closed. I had access. I had information. I had 2 hours before they would finish tracing the security flag my committee visit had generated. I used all three. I do not describe this as a plan because it was not a plan. A plan has expected outcomes and probability estimates and contingencies. This was something simpler. The only action I had remaining that was not surrender. There is a specific clarity in making an irreversible decision. All the weight of the options you are no longer carrying, gone at once. And I had that clarity in the 11 minutes I was transmitting, and then the signal went dead, and the clarity went with it. And what remained was the door opening and the technical folding of my jacket. I did the thing that ended my life in the Citadel. I tried to tell people. I had access to broadcast channels, to internal communication networks, to the data streams that reached every screen in the complex. Together, what I knew. The reclassification methodology, the arbitrariness of the Tier 3 threshold, the numbers of people relocated over the previous 5 years, and what I had begun to piece together about what relocation actually meant. Found in the Citadel's own administrative archive, a document titled Preserve Efficiency Review, Year 17 that used language no one who understood it could misread. Yield, processing throughput, target saturation by sector. I included this in what I transmitted. It reached approximately 40 terminals before the security division shut it down. I know it reached 40 because the shutdown logs still visible on my terminal when they came into my office. And I had enough professional habit left to read it before they took me away from the desk. 40 terminals, in a complex of 11,000 people. I did not know at the time whether 40 was enough or not. Shit. I have since learned that it was enough for 6 people to do something with what they had seen. 6 people, in the months and years that followed, who acted on what those 40 screens had shown them for the few minutes they were up. 2 hours after the shutdown, they came for me. They did not kill me in the Citadel. That would have been a waste of the preserve's resources. One of their own phrases turned around on itself without their noticing. Instead, they stripped my credentials, stripped my clearance badge, stripped my jacket in the processing room. This last detail I remember with particular clarity, the way one of the technicians folded the jacket with bureaucratic neatness before setting it on a shelf, as though tidiness was a form of respect, as though the ceremony of folding made what came next orderly. And they drove me out in a transport vehicle to the edge of the plateau and pushed me down the embankment into the wasteland below. The embankment was steep, and I fell badly and lay at the bottom for a few minutes in the rubble, cataloging damaged the way I cataloged equipment faults. Elbow abraded, ribs possibly cracked on the right side, left ankle wrenched but functional. The sky above the plateau's edge was a pale gray, and the air smelled of the wasteland's particular smell. Burnt earth and rust and something organic underneath, like old iron left out in the rain for years. I had smelled it occasionally from the Citadel windows when the wind came from the valley. I had not thought much about what produced it. Clara was already down there. She had been relocated 3 days early. I learned this later, from her, in the dark under a section of collapsed highway, about 3 kilometers from the embankment. She had been watching the base of the embankment at intervals, hoping. Finding me there, I think, was the first thing in 4 days that had gone as she'd hoped. She led me to the shelter without ceremony, moving low and fast along a drainage channel, and I followed without asking questions because she clearly knew something I did not, which was the situation in its entirety. "They hunt us," she said. We were sitting in the dark under the collapsed span, with our backs against the concrete, and she said it the way you say something you have been rehearsing. With the flat tone of someone reporting a fact they have not yet fully processed as real. Vehicles sometimes on foot. They come down from the Citadel on designated days. It's organized. There are squads. They have assigned sectors. They communicate with each other. She paused. They have quotas. I lay on the broken concrete and looked at the underside of the collapsed span above us and thought about Preserve Efficiency Review. Year 17. Its saturation by sector. Harvest yield. I thought about the protocols I had designed. The clean interface. The red text, the elegant intake system I had built without following the chain downstream. The document had not used the word hunt either. It had used the word harvest. I was beginning to understand that the Citadel's bureaucracy had a specific talent for replacing words with other words that meant the same thing while feeling entirely different. "How many are out here?" I asked. "Thousands, spread across the valley. Some are organized in small groups. People who found each other. Most aren't. The hunters prefer it when we're scattered. Scattered targets don't coordinate. Coordinated targets could do things that scattered ones can't." I asked how she had survived 4 days. She showed me her hands. There was dried blood on the knuckles, and what looked like chemical burns on the right palm, and under the burns the skin had the particular tightness of something that had been wet and then dried repeatedly in cold air. She had found a hunter's supply cache on the 2nd day. They left equipment staged at intervals for their own use, she explained, pre-positioned for the long hunts, and she had taken what she could carry and set a fire in it with a battery and a wire to cover her tracks and slow any pursuit. She had learned the fire trick from a man she'd found sheltering 2 kilometers west. He had been shot through the chest by a hunter's rifle an hour after he'd taught her. She said this last part without inflection. She was a botanist. She had spent her career in controlled conditions, careful observation, patient measurement. The wasteland had not broken her, it had concentrated her. I am a man who fixes machines. I looked at my wife's burned hands and understood that I was not going to be able to fix this particular problem with the tools I had. What I could do was think. It is the thing I am actually good at, not the only thing, as it turned out, but the foundation of the rest. Not bravery, not endurance. Not the particular kind of animal stubbornness that keeps a man moving when his body has given him every reasonable argument to stop. Those came later, and they came partly from Clara, and partly from Sam, and partly from A kind of anger that I had not previously known I was capable of, which settled into something harder and more useful than anger once it had burned down to coals. What I had, in the beginning, was the habit of looking at a broken system and working backward from the malfunction to the cause. The hunters were organized. Organization requires communication. Communication requires equipment. Equipment has frequencies, schedules, and maintenance patterns. Equipment has vulnerabilities. I had built communications infrastructure for the Citadel for 11 years. I knew how Citadel systems were designed. I could find a receiver. I could listen. If I could listen, I could map the hunt's architecture. If I could map it, I could predict movement. Prediction was the beginning of survival. We moved at night. Clara had already determined that the hunters' vehicles used low-beam lighting to conserve power cells, which meant the beams were visible from a distance if you were elevated above the valley floor. She had found 3 elevated positions in the first 4 days. A water tower, still structurally sound. A concrete pylon from an old transport junction. A section of elevated rail that had survived the collapse of its supporting structure, from which you could observe the vehicle beams moving through the valley and deduce the hunt's active zones for any given night. She had been mapping this in her head, because she had no materials to write on and no light to write by, and the map she carried in her head was more complete than anything I could have produced in the same time. I want to record this clearly, because I have thought about it often and it matters. She taught me how to survive in the preserve. I arrived with credentials and technical knowledge, and a head full of protocols, and she had been there 4 days, and she knew more than I did about staying alive. I followed her lead without argument. This was not modesty on my part. It was the correct operational decision, and I made it because I could see that it was correct, which is not quite the same as being modest, but produces similar outcomes. A man who cannot set aside his own claimed authority, when someone else clearly knows more, is a man who will die of pride. And pride is a luxury the preserve did not offer. We were six weeks in the preserve when we found Sam. He was not hiding exactly. His shelter was a converted equipment shed at the far southern end of the valley, in a section of terrain that the hunters treated as an operational boundary. The ground there was broken and unpredictable, all subsided concrete and exposed rebar and channels that could take an ankle at speed, and the hunters' vehicles could not navigate it without significant risk of damage. Sam had understood this years ago and positioned himself accordingly. He had been in the preserve for 11 years. He was the only man I met in the preserve who had been there that long, and was not in some way diminished by it. He was not unaffected. He had the stillness of a man who has made his peace with a very narrow existence. And certain conversations would reach a point past which he would not go. And I eventually understood that those points marked the places where 11 years had compressed something, that there was no longer any room to expand. But he was whole. He had not gone feral. He had not constructed a private mythology to make the situation bearable. He had simply continued, which is the hardest thing a person can do when continuing offers no particular reward. He was a former law enforcement officer from one of the border settlements, a large man gone lean, with hands that had the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned to do things once and correctly. He looked at us for a long time when we came into his shed, examining us with the assessment of a man who has learned to read people by how they arrive rather than what they claim. "You're from the Citadel," he said. "I used to work there," I said. "Doing what?" "Building the systems that sent people here." He was quiet for a moment, not surprised, not angry, or at least not visibly angry. He looked at Clara's burned hands and then at me, and then back at Clara. "You came after her voluntarily," he said. Again, an observation rather than a question. "She's my wife, that's not what I asked." I thought about it. "Yes," I said. He nodded. "All right. Sit down." That was Sam. No performance, no extended interrogation. He fed us from his stores. Dried protein tablets. Rehydrated root vegetables from a garden he kept in a sealed section of the shed, under a UV lamp he had built from salvaged components. Clean water from a multi-stage filtration setup he had constructed and refined over years. And while we ate, he asked questions in his methodical way. He asked about the geography of the preserve, what Clara had observed. He asked about the hunters' patterns, He asked about my technical background in specific and practical terms. Not the title, but the actual work. What systems, what architecture, what protocols. He was building a picture, and when he had built it, he stopped asking and sat with it for a while. What he told us, eventually, took the rest of that night. The hunters were not simply indulging a sport, though they experienced it as sport. They were also training. The committee used the preserve as a proving ground for its security division. Junior hunters came here under the supervision of senior ones, learning to track moving targets in irregular terrain, to maintain psychological composure during active pursuit, to develop the specific detachment from the humanity of what they were shooting that the Citadel's enforcement apparatus required of its personnel. The preserve was not merely a killing field. It was a curriculum. The people in it were the coursework. It started about 20 years ago, Sam said. Small at first, 2-3 hunters, deniable. Then it expanded. Slaw. A cop at one of the border checkpoints. When I first figured out what was happening, I had access to transit records, could see the torch schedules, the timing, the fact that people were going into the valley and nothing was coming back out. I tried to document it. Tried to get word out through official channels. The official channels were run by the committee, so you can guess how that went. How long before they sent you here? 8 months after I started asking questions. I'd had time to prepare at least. I'd been moving supplies for 2 years, caching them, learning the terrain from the outside. When they came for me, I was ready enough. He looked at his hands. Ready enough and still almost didn't make it through the first winter. He knew the current senior hunters by description from years of observation. He described the man who led the active cohort. Tall, with a precise and unhurried manner, a habit of pausing before each shot to recalibrate his scope, even when the range made recalibration unnecessary. The affectation of a marksman, Sam said. The kind of thing a man develops when he has never had to hurry, because nothing has ever threatened him. He had been hunting the preserve for 9 years. He kept a leather notebook. Sam had seen it through binoculars once at distance, when the man had stopped to make a notation after a kill. I thought about that notebook for a long time afterward, the impulse to record, the need to enumerate and account for what you had done. I understood that impulse. I had kept meticulous logs for 11 years. Calibration records, scan results, threshold adjustments, classification volumes. We were both men who wrote things down with care. The difference was not the act of recording, but what was being recorded. His notebook held people. Mine had held numbers. I had not examined what the numbers referred to, because examining what numbers refer to is a habit that can be inconvenient. And I had cultivated convenience for a long time. Sam trained us. The word is insufficient, but there is no better one. He did not train us to be soldiers. That would have required years we did not have, and materials that I was, frankly, not. He trained us to be harder to kill. The distinction matters. Training for capacity takes a long time and builds something new. Training to be harder to kill takes less time and mostly removes things. The habit of moving in predictable straight lines. The habit of choosing cover that looks substantial rather than cover that is actually obscuring. The habit of making fires. The habit of sleeping in the same location twice in sequence. The habit of moving at the same time every day. The habit of trusting a sector because it had been quiet yesterday. Every habit that the hunters relied on their prey having. Sam removed them methodically, one by one, replacing each with something that cost nothing but practice. He was unsentimental in the instruction. When we were slow, he repeated without comment. When we made an error that could have gotten someone killed, he described the consequence specifically and concretely and moved on. He did not berate and he did not praise. He transferred what he knew with the efficiency of a man who understood that efficiency was kindness in these conditions. Clara was a better student than I was in the physical disciplines. This should not have surprised me given everything I have already told you. But I had spent 11 years in an environment that rewarded my particular kind of intelligence at every turn. And there is a specific discomfort in the discovery that the intelligence you have been relying on is the wrong kind for the situation at hand. The wasteland required a different kind of attention, a broader sensory vigilance, a constant reading of wind and light and sound as threat indicators, a body knowledge of terrain that I had to build from scratch, while Clara was already well into building it. Sam noticed the gap without commenting on it. He assigned tasks accordingly. What he assigned to me was the communications work. He had a salvaged signal receiver, old and partially functional. The display had failed. The frequency calibration circuit was corroded, and 2 of the 4 input channels were dead. He had kept it for years because he understood in the abstract that it should be valuable, but he had lacked the specific knowledge of the Citadel's frequency architecture to make it useful. I examined it over 2 evenings and understood what had failed and what the repair required. I spent 2 days fabricating replacement components from salvage. This is the kind of thing that sounds difficult and is actually more tedious than difficult. A matter of patience and careful hands, which I had, and on the 4th day the receiver functioned. The hunters used burst transmissions on a rotating cipher with a fixed interval structure. It was not sophisticated encryption. It was designed for operational security in the field, not for resistance to a determined technical analysis. And a determined technical analysis was what I gave it. 2 weeks of listening. I mapped the transmission schedule, identified the sector codes, and decoded enough of the operational vocabulary to build a working model of how the hunt was organized on any given day. Which sectors were active, which were resting, which were being transitioned between squads. From this, I built a map. It existed only in my memory. Writing it down was a security risk we could not afford, but I held it there with the same precision I had used for circuit diagrams, updating it with each new transmission. Clara and Sam learned to read it through me, asking questions in the form of practical decisions. Where are they today? Where are they likely to be tomorrow? Where is the gap we can move through? We moved through the gaps. We began to move with a kind of agency that we had not had before, which was not safety. Nothing in the preserve was safety, but was the beginning of something that felt like it. This went on for 4 months. I want to describe it as having an arc, a trajectory, a sense of building towards something. That is not how it felt from inside. From inside it felt like subsistence. Like the daily labor of staying alive had become the entire content of existence, filling every hour with its requirements, and there was nothing beyond it that felt real. Sam had lived this way for 11 years. I returned to this fact often in the dark, trying to understand what it required of a person. He had not given up. He had not invented a compensating mythology. He had not gone rigid with bitterness or loose with despair. He had simply continued, day after day, maintaining his shelter and his knowledge and his physical condition and his capacity for clear observation in a situation that offered no reward for continuing except the continuation itself. There were people in the preserve who had not managed this. We encountered them occasionally, sometimes from a distance, observing before approaching, because in the preserve a man moving toward you openly was as likely to mean danger as assistance. And the ones who had been there longest showed it in different ways. Some had gone very quiet, retreated entirely into an internal world that the external one could no longer reach. Some had gone the other direction, loud and expansive, and slightly disconnected, filling the silence with words that ran past the things they were actually feeling. Some had organized themselves in small groups that operated with a territorial ferocity toward strangers, having learned that the distinction between threat and ally was not always clear, and having resolved the ambiguity by treating everything as threat. All of these were rational responses to the situation. None of them were sustainable over the long term. Sam had done, and what I was slowly learning to do, was narrower and harder. Stay present. Stay technical. Keep the attention on the immediate and solvable problem. The filtration needs maintenance. The receiver's calibration needs adjustment. The sector transmissions will come in at this interval, and we need to be in a position to receive them. There is always something that needs to be done better, and the discipline of doing it better is the discipline of not being somewhere else in your own head, which is where the worst of it lives. I am not a man given to the kind of observation I am making here. I spent 11 years in the Citadel functioning as a pure technician. Problem identification, solution design, implementation, documentation, and the internal life of the work was the work itself. What I am describing is something I learned in conditions I would not have chosen, and I describe it not because it is interesting as personal history, but it is the thing that kept us functional enough to do what we eventually did. Still encountered people who were in immediate danger, some of whom we helped, and some of whom we could not help. I do not catalog these encounters, because the accounting of them is not the point of this account, and because some of them I would rather carry privately. What I will say is that Clara was consistently more capable in those moments than I was. She had a direct and practical manner with frightened people, informed by whatever those first 4 days alone in the preserve had done to her understanding of what frightened people actually need, which is not reassurance but information and a specific next action. Give me the next thing to do, and she gave them that, and most of the time it helped. I asked him once, late in the second month, what had kept him going. He thought about it seriously. He was not a man who gave unthought answers. He sat with the question the way he sat with most things. Without hurry, without the performance of consideration, just actually considering. Something to do, he said finally. I kept finding things to do. The shelter needed improving. The filtration needed upgrading. There was always something that needed to be better. A man who has work doesn't have as much room for the other things. I asked what the other things were. He looked at me steadily. The same things that are in everyone's head in here, if they're honest about it. Anger that there's nowhere to put. Grief for what's gone, the arithmetic of the years. He paused. I decided early that doing the arithmetic of the years was a poor use of the years I had left, so I kept finding work instead. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it during the hours at the receiver, during the circuit fabrication, during the mapping exercises that Clara and I ran together in the dark. Call and response, sector codes, movement vectors, building the shared language of the map I carried in my head. Work was a kind of mercy. Work was the specific gravity that kept a man from drifting into the parts of the situation that could not be improved by any amount of attention. What ended the 4 months was not a plan. Precise about this because there is a version of this story where I am the strategist, the man who engineered the outcome, and that version is not accurate. What ended it was a failure, a mistake, an absence. The hunters found Clara. I was not with her. I have to say this plainly, without softening, because there is no version of it that is comfortable. I was not with her. Sam and I had moved a kilometer south to a relay point where the transmission reception was better. To pull signals during what the schedule indicated was the hunter's most active communication window. Clara had stayed at the shelter because her knee had been swelling for 2 days. An impact injury from a wrong landing on broken concrete 2 weeks earlier. The kind of thing that heals slowly in the conditions we were living in. And the kilometer was more than the knee could manage without significant pain and noise risk. We had assessed the sector as quiet by the transmission schedule. We were correct by the schedule. What we had not accounted for was that the man with the leather notebook did not always follow the schedule. The trainees followed protocols. Sam had told us this in the first weeks. The trainees followed the protocols because that was how they were learning, and the protocols were what they were being taught. The senior hunters followed their own instinct, which in 9 years of daily practice had become something closer to art, a reading of the terrain and the weather and the patterns of movement that told them where prey was likely to be on any given afternoon independent of any written schedule. He found the shelter in the early afternoon. We heard the shot from a kilometer away. I had learned to read the acoustic signature of shots in the wasteland. The terrain shaped the sound in ways that carried information about the origin and character of the discharge. This shot had a flat, wide-area quality that told me it was not a precise kill shot, a miss, or a warning. It meant there was still movement. It meant she was alive at the moment the trigger was pulled. I do not remember making a decision to run back. I remember that I was running, and Sam was running beside me without a word exchanged between us, and his rifle was at port arms, and his breathing was controlled, and mine was not. She had made it 300 meters from the shelter. We found her in a drainage culvert, low against the concrete, her knee clearly giving her real trouble from the sprint across broken ground. She had her head up, and she was watching the terrain behind her with the attention of someone who has decided not to waste energy on fear and is using it for observation instead. She saw us coming from 50 meters out, and I watched something in her face change. Not relief exactly, because relief implies that fear was the prior state. And I don't think fear was quite what she had been running on. Something more like confirmation. Like she had calculated that we would come and she was confirming the calculation. The only reason she was alive was that the man with the notebook preferred not to hurry. Sam had described this specific characteristic in the early weeks of our time with him. The senior hunters, and this one in particular, did not rush the interval between the flushing and the kill. They liked the extension of the process. In 9 years, this preference had never cost him a target, because in 9 years, no one had ever come back for one of his targets. He was recalibrating for another shot, taking his time. When Sam and I came out of the terrain on his left flank, he was very fast. He had the rifle up and tracking before I had fully registered that he was where he was. Sam took the first round in the left shoulder. I heard the impact before I heard Sam's sound, a brief controlled exhale, and Sam went down to one knee and did not go further down, and he brought his own rifle up from that one-kneed position and fired. The shot was low. It did not hit the man with the notebook, but it hit the vehicle he was using for partial cover. Close enough and loud enough that the man moved. And movement was the thing we needed. And Clara came out of the culvert and we collapsed into the terrain. Sam leaving blood on the cracked earth behind him. Clara supporting more of his weight than her knee should have been asked to manage, and me navigating. I knew where I was going. I had known for 2 months in the abstract, the way you know a thing that you are not yet ready to act on. Held in reserve, turning it over occasionally, examining it for the flaw that would make it impossible. The flaw had never materialized. The Citadel's supply route entered the preserve at a specific point in the eastern perimeter wall. A reinforced gate, a guard station, an equipment depot. The hunters used it to move their vehicles, their ammunition, their personnel, their provisions, in and out of the preserve. I knew the gate schedule from 2 months of transmission interception. I knew the shift change gap and its precise duration. I knew the locking mechanism on the gate because it was a variant of the same architecture I had installed on level 3 storage in the Citadel 7 years ago. The Citadel's engineers had a habit of reusing successful designs, and I had designed this one, and the override procedure was in my memory as clearly as the day I had documented it. We moved through the afternoon terrain with the hunters' communication traffic, telling me in real time which sectors they were in. The man with the notebook was behind us. I could track his check-in transmissions. But the rough ground between us and the gate was costing him time, and something in his transmission cadence had changed. A subtle thing. Sam had described what a near miss does to a man who has not experienced one in 9 years, and I was hearing it now in the intervals between signals. The rhythm had shifted slightly. He was adjusting. We reached the gate at the shift change. Sam sat against the perimeter wall, with his hand flat against the shoulder wound and his rifle across his knees, and his eyes working the terrain behind us with the patient sweep of a man who will do what is required of him until he cannot. Clara kept watch from the corner of the guard station. I worked the gate. The override took 4 minutes. 3 of them were finding the panel access point under the station's external cladding, which had been installed differently in the field than the design drawings specified. Field modification, corner cutting, the small divergences between planned and built that I had spent 11 years reconciling in the Citadel's maintenance logs. The 4th minute was the override itself, which went exactly as I had constructed it in my memory. The gate opened. We went through. The equipment depot was a study in institutional order. Vehicle maintenance bays, 3 of them, with tools racked and labeled on pegboards. An armory with a wire cage door, unlocked. Why would it need to be locked inside the Citadel's own operational perimeter? A communications relay station, rack-mounted equipment in a climate-controlled room, indicator lights, steady green. A medical station, an administration block with a workstation and a printer and a shelf of paper files. Break room with a coffee machine that was still on. All of it was clean. All of it was organized. All of it reflected the same institutional habits of order and efficiency that I had lived inside for 11 years. The same handwriting on the labels, the same filing conventions, the same logic of a well-maintained operation, applied without examination to the content of the operation. I looked at the coffee machine for a moment. Then I went to the armory. We took what we needed. Sam transitioned to a sidearm with the unhurried practicality of a man who has inventoried his own limitations and adjusted accordingly. The shoulder made a long weapon unreliable. Clara took a long weapon and a medical kit from the station and used the kit on Sam's shoulder while I worked the communications relay. Bleeding was slowing. The round had passed through cleanly without hitting the major vessels, which was the best outcome available. She worked with the precision of a woman accustomed to careful observation and patient technique. And Sam endured it without theater. I sat at the relay console and pulled up the broadcast architecture. Took 3 minutes to locate the Citadel's internal channel, the same channel I had used 11 months ago, for approximately 11 minutes. Before the security division shut it down, I recognized the frequency immediately. I had helped design this infrastructure too. I opened the channel and I talked. I told them the schedule. I told them the quotas. The annual targets, by sector, which were in an administrative file on the relay's network share, labeled with the same bloodless language the committee used for everything. I told them the names of the senior hunters. Every name Sam had gathered over 11 years. I told them the number I had found in the archive buffer, 80 million. 80 million. In a preserve that had been running for 20 years, against a clean population of 400,000. I said the number slowly and clearly, the way you say a number that does not fit in the mind all at once, the way you give someone time to try to hold it. I described the leather notebook. I described the equipment depot I was sitting in, clean and organized and fully stocked, with a coffee machine that was still on. I described the educational function of the preserve, the training purpose, the deliberate cultivation of detachment. I said that the preserve was not an emergency measure or a resource management necessity. It was a school for a specific kind of person. And the committee had been running it for 20 years, and the curriculum was killing. I transmitted for 11 minutes before the signal was jammed. The same duration as the first time, give or take. I found this almost funny. In the way that patterns become funny when you have been living inside systems long enough to recognize them running automatically. I did not know how many people heard it. I know that more than the first time, the 6 people who had acted on what the first 40 screens had shown became part of a larger number who acted on the second transmission, and that number in turn reached people outside the Citadel through channels I had not anticipated, because systems that are well designed for transmission are well designed in all directions. I had built a capable communications architecture. It worked as intended. The man with the notebook came through the gate while the relay was still open. He had come through on foot, leaving his vehicle at the perimeter, too wide for the gate at speed. And he moved through the depot with the same focused economy I had observed at a distance earlier, the complete absence of wasted motion that comes from long practice. He was tracking by sound, following my voice through the relay room door. And he was very nearly quiet enough that I did not hear him until he was at the corner of the room. He came around the corner with the rifle up, and Clara in his field of fire. Sam shot from the doorway of the armory. The shoulder meant the shot ran low. It was still, in the strictest mechanical sense, a remarkable piece of work. A one-armed sidearm discharge from the stand position under active threat, on a target partially obscured, at a range that would have challenged a 2-armed man. And it hit the man low on the right side, and he went down with the controlled management of a trained man being hit, taking the fall into a position that still gave him angles and kept the rifle in his hands. He was recalibrating. He was doing the arithmetic of the room. Positions, angles, the time it would take to bring the rifle to bear on each of us, the optimal sequence. I was already moving. I had in my hand a signal disruption tool from the relay station's maintenance kit. A heavy cylindrical device, about 40 centimeters long, designed for shunting live current through malfunctioning circuit boards, weighs approximately 3 kilograms and is solid cast, and it is not a weapon. I want to be precise about this. It is not a weapon, and I had not taken it from the rack thinking of it as a weapon. I had taken it automatically, the way you pick up a familiar tool when your hands are moving before your mind is. Used that tool hundreds of times in the Citadel. My hands knew it. The rifle was tracking toward Clara. I crossed the floor and I hit him with it twice. He did not get up after the second one. I stood over him in the equipment depot of his hunting ground, and I looked at him for a long time. He was a large man, well-maintained, with the lean musculature of someone who had stayed physically capable through deliberate effort for many years. He had a leather notebook in his jacket pocket. I could see the corner of it. I thought about whether to look at the tally it contained. I decided I did not need to. I already knew the shape of it, and the shape was sufficient. Some things do not require counting. We held the depot for 2 days. Sam's shoulder needed time, and Clara's knee needed time, and I used the time to work through the relay's full archive, copying everything onto data drives from the equipment store. The 11 minutes of transmission I had managed were incomplete. A summary, a partial disclosure. The archive was the full record. Schedules dating back 19 years. Operational reports, training assessments, tally summaries, correspondence between the Citadel Committee and the Preserve Administration. Correspondence was particularly thorough. The committee had kept excellent records. They always did. The data drives went out through channels Sam had spent 11 years building. People at the border settlements who owed him caution. Couriers who moved between the outpost communities in the valley periphery. A network assembled over years, precisely because he had understood that the information, when it finally existed in the right form, would need a way to travel. He had prepared for an outcome he might not see, because preparing was a thing to do, and a man who has work doesn't have as much room for the other things. Preserve was shut down 8 months later. The hunting program was terminated. The committee was restructured, not abolished, because the Citadel still needed a governance structure, and dismantling the entire administrative apparatus without a replacement would have caused its own kind of catastrophic collapse, but restructured in ways that were slow and contested, and imperfect and permanent. The clean flash contaminated classification system was revised from a death sentence to a medical classification, which is what it should always have been. People who had been in the preserve began to be located, documented, offered return or support in the valley communities they had built for themselves. Process was incomplete in ways it will probably always be incomplete. The mathematics of 20 years cannot be reversed. I was not present for most of this. The better part of a year after the depot, I was back in the preserve, moving through the valley with Clara, finding people who did not yet know that the hunt was over. Some of them had been there for years. Some of them did not believe us at first. They had developed a very reasonable distrust of information that seemed too good, and we had to be patient with it. Clara was better at this than I was. She had a particular quality of presence, an earned steadiness that people in extreme circumstances recognize in each other, and after what she had been through, it was real enough to read. Sam did not live to see the committee restructure. He died 4 months after the depot, in the shelter he had built himself over 11 years in the rough southern terrain, of complications from the shoulder wound that we had done what we could for, and that what we could do was not sufficient. The round had passed through cleanly, but the conditions were what they were, and infection is patient and thorough, and Sam was 63 years old, and had spent 11 years in circumstances that do not preserve a man's reserves. He died without complaint and without drama, he said. 2 days before, that he was glad the depot had worked out. He said it the way he said most things, as an observation stated cleanly, requiring no elaboration. I have thought about him nearly every day since. I think about what it takes to continue for 11 years in those conditions, building and maintaining and preparing for an outcome you might not see. I think about what he said. A man who has work doesn't have as much room for the other things. I have tried to live by this, and I am not sure I have the capacity for it that he had. He was a particular kind of person. I am grateful I met him. Clara's knee healed badly, and then slowly, and then, eventually, well enough. She returned to her work. There is a soil reclamation project in the Southern Valley now. in one of the old preserve sectors, where a team is attempting to establish vegetation in ground that was stripped and compacted and chemically altered by 20 years of vehicle traffic, and worse. The soil resists. It is full of things that do not belong in soil, the residue of what was done there. Clara tends it with the same patient observation she has always brought to difficult growing conditions. She says the plants that establish first in damaged soil are usually the ones that everyone else wrote off. She says this without apparent reference to anything else, though I notice the fact. I do not fix the old machines anymore. I work on the revised classification system. Its protocols, its software, its threshold models. The places where it has been rebuilt from the original architecture, and the places where the original architecture still shows through like an old foundation under new construction. I try to build in the corrections for the errors the original version was designed to obscure. It is painstaking work and often tedious, and I am working on something I built bad the first time. Something I built without asking what it was for. Something I maintained for 11 years with professional pride, while it did what it was designed to do. There is no position from which this is comfortable. I have decided not to look for one. What I know is this. The system classified Clara as waste, a resource negative unit, a number in an allocation column to be removed from the ledger. It had performed the same calculation on 80 million others and reached the same conclusion 80 million times, smoothly and efficiently, and without mechanical failure. Because the machine was well built, and I had helped to build it. One man declining to accept the machine's conclusion is not an override. It is not a revolution. It is not in any meaningful sense a plan. It is a small and badly executed act performed at considerable cost by a man who was not especially brave, not especially strong, who had spent 11 years as a component of the machine he was then trying to break, and who knew, in the moment he made the choice, exactly what it was likely to cost him and made it anyway. Machines are built by people. This is what the committee and its architects perpetually underestimate, because they think of themselves as the architects and everyone else as the components. Machines are built by people, and people contain things that no specification can account for, and one of those things, perhaps the least dramatic, perhaps the most ordinary, is the decision to go back. Not to calculate whether going back is tactically optimal, not to weigh the expected value of going back against the risk. To simply go back because she is there, and she taught you how to survive, and she is yours, and that is the whole of the arithmetic. I went back. 11 years later, I am still not sure exactly what that act was in terms of category or significance. I am sure of what it started, and I am sure that the machine, for all its precision, for all the elegant redundancy of its sensor arrays, for all the clean interface and the efficient intake protocols, had no variable for it. The machine had modeled prey. It had not modeled the specific stubbornness of a man who had built it, and knew its tolerances, and understood, in his particular technical way, exactly which component, if you applied sufficient force at exactly the right angle, would not hold. That was enough. That is, as far as I can tell, always enough.